From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted.
The Vanished Suitor of Shooter's Hill. In the early part of the 1880s, there lived in Vermont House, Shooter's Hill, the widow of a retired city merchant named Rungate, and her only child Bertha. Mrs. Rungate, who gave one the impression of being a rather shy, reserved woman, did not know many people in this district of London. She was not over-robust for one thing, and for another her income was strictly limited, each a sufficient reason in itself for not entertaining. Mrs. Rungate's one interest in life was Bertha, who seems to have been allowed to do pretty nearly anything she liked. As she evinced a great dislike of lessons, she did not go to school, and up to the age of 16 could neither read nor write. She was not a tomboy, however, and appears to have been very fond of dress, possessing a knowledge of the world far beyond her years. Her chief amusement was to powder up and adorn herself in all the finery she could procure, and parade about in Greenwich Park, making eyes at all the well-dressed young men she saw. Bertha's conduct at length became so noticeable that her mother was eventually obliged to tell the girl she would have to place her under some restraint. A governess then made her appearance at Vermont House, to be speedily followed by another and another, none of them being able to cope with a self-willed and disobedient girl, who was supported in all her extravagant behaviour by her foolishly adoring parent. At last, however, when it had become the recognized rule for the governess to leave at the end of 6 weeks, the unexpected happened. In answer to the unusual advertisement in the Sunday Times, a young woman called Jane Ducrot obtained the situation, and from the moment of her arrival showed she had a very different influence over her pupil to that possessed by any of her predecessors. There was something in Jane Ducrot's appearance, and what were subsequently described as her dark flashing eyes, in her well-moulded chin and strong mouth, as well as in her firm and decisive manners, that not only awed but curiously enough seemed to attract Bertha. At all events, the girl consented to remain in the study with her, presumably to do lessons. The two were often seen on the Heath and in Greenwich Park together, Bertha still in all her finery, and Jane Ducrot in a plain tailor-made coat and skirt, and those who noticed them took them to be on very friendly terms. It was now observed that whereas prior to Miss Ducrot's arrival Bertha, despite her obvious efforts to the contrary, was seldom seen out of doors in the company of a man, she was often seen with members of the opposite sex when accompanied by her governess, unkind critics remarking that it was Miss Ducrot and not Bertha who was the attraction. Jane Ducrot had been at Vermont House about 6 months when great excitement was caused in the household by the advent of Philip Rungate, a nephew of the late Mr. Rungate. Mrs. Rungate had no sooner received tidings of Philip's proposed visit than she made grand preparations for his reception, repeatedly informing Miss Ducrot how wealthy he was, and how confidently she anticipated he would marry her daughter. Bertha also took Miss Ducrot into her confidence, telling her how fond she was of Philip, and showing her affectionate letters she had frequently received from him. From what the mother and daughter both said, Miss Ducrot could have had little doubt in her mind that they were bent on capturing Philip, and expected him to finally pledge himself to Bertha during his impending visit. The eventful day came at last. Philip Rungate arrived, paid his respects to mother and daughter, and immediately started talking to Miss Ducrot. It was very possible he had met her somewhere before. Anyhow, he lost no time in improving the shining hour, nor did anyone at the time apparently resent such rapid friendship. It was not until he had been in the home for nearly a fortnight that the harmony that had hitherto existed met with its first discordant note. Philip had left the house directly after breakfast with the announced intention of meeting an old schoolfellow in the city, and Bertha, happening to stroll into the long wilderness of a back garden after morning lessons, had found him secreted at very close quarters in the summer house with Jane Ducrot, who appeared much disconcerted at being discovered. Philip offered a blundering explanation to the effect that, returning earlier than he had anticipated, he had entered the premises by the back way, and seeing the summer house door open, had ventured in. There he had found Miss Ducrot, who was suffering with a bad headache, and had chosen that sanctuary as it was cool and quiet. Bertha said nothing to either of them, but she told her mother, and the two took to covertly watching Philip and the governess. For some days nothing of any moment occurred, and then Bertha, leaving the two together in the drawing-room on the pretext of running upstairs, returned immediately and surprised them in the act of kissing. Bertha at once informed her mother, and Miss Ducrot was peremptorily summoned into the latter's presence. She unhesitatingly admitted being in love with Philip. A violent scene ensued, and she was eventually given a fortnight's notice. That was on May 1st. The days that followed saw a complete change in the atmosphere of the household. Whereas everything had run smoothly before, all was now discord and depression. Bertha shut herself up in her bedroom most of the day. Mrs. Rungate continually nagged at Jane Ducrot, and Philip wandered about as if unable to make up his mind whether to go or to stay. Matters went on this way until the morning of May 14th, when Bertha burst into her mother's room, almost speechless with rage, and told her she had caught Philip and the governess together again in the summer house, and that they were behaving like an engaged couple. As Miss Ducrot was leaving the next day, Miss Rungate advised her daughter to say nothing about it. "Wait till the witch goes," the fond mother advised, "and then, when she asks for a character, I will speak to her." At lunch, however, a bombshell was dropped by Philip when he announced his intention of returning home by an early train the following day. "He is going away with her," Bertha whispered hoarsely. "I fear so," her mother replied, "but I don't see how we can prevent it." That evening, at about 8 o'clock, Philip went into the back garden, and a few minutes afterwards Bertha was seen by one of the servants going there too. It was then getting dusk, and rain was falling heavily. At 9:30 or thereabouts, Martha returned alone, looking very white and agitated. That night Philip did not come in, nor did he turn up for breakfast. Nor was he, despite the efforts of his friends, ever heard of again. He vanished as wholly and completely as if the earth had swallowed him. It is a curious thing that a man can disappear without causing any great sensation, but it is by no means so uncommon as one might suppose, and it certainly was so in the case of Philip Rungate. Mrs. Rungate and Bertha declared he had left them in a huff, and their explanation was not disputed. What was generally surmised, when the previous state of affairs at Vermont House leaked out, was that he had gone off with Jane Ducrot. But if so, he must have joined her in London, for when she left Blackheath village station by the 9:30 a.m. train, she was certainly alone. After this episode, the Rungates stayed on at Vermont House till 1896. They then went to the Isle of Wight. Bertha died in 1904, and Mrs. Rungate in 1906. In the autumn of 1910, I first heard that Vermont House was haunted. My information was a Mr. Harper. He had taken the house in 1908, but had been obliged to leave it before the year was out, owing to extraordinary noises and the figures of a man and girl that were constantly seen prowling about the garden. I made inquiries about the former tenants. He told me, and they said they had experienced the same phenomena, and had left purely on that account. The case seeming to be well corroborated, I decided to investigate it, and on the evening of January 3rd, 1911, entered the premises of Vermont House, armed with a torchlight and revolver, and accompanied by my pet fox terrier. I first made a thorough examination of the place, poking into all the cupboards and recesses, and even climbing through the skylight onto the roof to see that no one was concealed anywhere. Then I locked the front door, bolted all the windows, brewed myself some coffee over a spirit kettle, gave the dogs some milk and biscuit, and meditated where I had better sit for my vigil. Finally I decided on the landing at the foot of the upper story, and there, half sitting, half lying on the floor, with my back against the wall and the dog close beside me, I waited. Confronting me was the dark staircase leading up and down, while on my right was what might once have been the drawing room, but which was now a dusty scene of bare boards and moonlight. On my left was an open window overlooking the long, weed-ridden back garden. 12 o'clock struck, the friendly footsteps of a passer-by died away in the distance, and I was now alone and deserted except for the dog lying quietly beside me among the shadows. All was now intensely still and hushed, and despite my firm resolve, I would have given much to be out in the open. The scratching of an insect made my heart stand still. My sight and hearing were painfully acute. Presently a familiar sickly sensation gradually crept over me. The throbbing of my heart increased, and the most desperate terror laid hold of me. The dog uttered a low savage snarl. The house was no longer empty. Something was on the landing overhead, preparing, so my senses told me, to descend. I could not stir, nor close my eyes. I could only sit there staring at the staircase, praying that the horror would soon emerge and that my ordeal would quickly be over. Down, down, down it came, until at last I could see it. A white, evil face, surmounted by a mass of black hair. The eyes were the most alarming feature. Large, dark, very lurid, very sinister. And they were fixed on mine with a mocking leer. So fascinated was I by them that I could hardly notice the rest of the face. I only saw it was very ugly and mal-shaped, and was that of a girl, presumably not more than 16 or 17 years of age. She was clad in a dark velvet dress, much beflounced, her wrists covered with silver bangles, and her fingers with rings. I did not observe her feet. She passed quite close to me, and putting a short, stubby finger to her lips, beckoned to me to follow. I roused myself and did so, and keeping close behind her, descended into the hall and out into the back garden. Leading me across a long, untidy strip of ground, she stopped at the entrance to a broken-down summer-house, and smiled evilly at me. As she did so, the most awful series of groans, as of some man in excruciating agony, came from within it. She then pointed to the furthest corner of the garden. There was a loud, reverberating crash, as if a whole cartload of stones had been dropped from a height onto the summer-house floor, and the girl vanished. Throwing open the door of the summer-house, I peered in, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the moonlight and shadows. I visited the premises again next day, and paid a man to dig in the spot indicated by the phantom. He worked hard, and after removing about 3 feet of soil, came upon something solid. It was a circular piece of iron with a ring on it. We both pulled at the ring, and after great exertions raised the iron cover to disclose a deep well. I went for additional help, and we let one of the party down the well with a rope. At the bottom he found the skeleton of a man, together with a knife and pocket watch marked with the initials P.R. There was nothing to show how the man had come by his end. It was then I made inquiries and learned the story of Bertha and Philip Rungate, which I have related. What is the explanation of it? In my opinion, based on what I saw and heard in the house and garden, it is this. Bertha, a naturally badly disposed and spoiled girl, infuriated beyond words at her cousin preferring Mr. Crott to herself, had followed him to the summer-house on the night of May 14th, and had given him either some poisoned food or drink. He died in the most acute agony, and Bertha, terrified as to what might happen to her, had taken immediate counsel with her adoring mother. There was a long disused well in the garden, and into this the mother and daughter dropped the body of Philip. Then they got a quantity of loose soil, and effectually concealed all traces of the well. The utter improbability of either of them committing a crime guaranteed their success. With the removal and burial of the skeleton after our discovery, the haunting ceased, and Vermont House became as quiet and homely as any of the other houses and Shooter's Hill Road. The Nurse's Return. Fleetwood, like Blackpool, does not impress one with being the sort of place to harbor ghosts, yet the Lancashire resort has possessed quite a number of bona fide haunted houses. The following account of one came to me recently. A few summers ago, a certain general and his wife were being driven through the town in a car they had hired for the summer months, when the attention of the wife was drawn to a tall woman in the gray uniform of a nurse who she saw before her on the road. The car had slackened speed, owing to the traffic, and the nurse was walking along with strides that far more resembled a man's than those of a woman. Furthermore, she was behaving in a very erratic manner, moving first to one side of the road and then to the other, and swerving in and out of the stream of vehicles in a manner that caused the general's wife the greatest apprehension. She called out to the chauffeur to go very slowly in case he should injure the woman. "Injure what woman, madam?" the chauffeur asked. "Why, the nurse!" the general's wife exclaimed. "The nurse?" the chauffeur repeated, puzzled. "Where is she?" "There, right before you!" the general's wife shrieked. "Oh, do be careful!" Her husband, who up to this time had made no comment, now leaned forward. "I don't see any nurse, Therese," he said. "Where is she?" "Why, there, there!" his wife called out, half rising from her seat and pointing frantically in front of her. "There she is, just in front of the car. No, now she's on the pavement. Now crossing again to the center. Oh, do be careful! She must be mad, poor thing. Oh, God, God! You've run her over!" In an instant the car stopped. The general and the driver jumped out together to extricate the woman, but to their amazement no woman was there. There was not a sign of one. "You must have imagined you saw her, Therese," the general said. "Don't be so silly, dear," his wife replied testily. "I saw her as plainly as I see you. I swear I did." Seeing that she was becoming quite hysterical, the general made no further comment on what appeared to him to be a complete delusion, but quietly got back into the car. Then they drove on, and not another word was said about the incident till the night after dinner. His wife then remarked, as soon as they were alone, "Charles, I do hope I am not going mad, but I have seen that nurse again." She then went on to explain that as she was coming down to dinner, she saw to her alarm a woman in grey ascending the staircase towards her, and as the woman drew nearer, she recognized her as the hospital nurse she had knocked down and run over by the car that morning. "I moved aside to let her pass by," she said, "but she did no such thing. She simply walked straight at me, and I believe went right through me, for I felt a dreadful sensation just after we seemed to be in contact. I turned around immediately and saw her going up the stairs quite unconcernedly, as if nothing had happened. When, however, she got to the top, she vanished. Dear, do you think I'm going out of my mind?" She was very much distressed. The general felt sure that what his wife had experienced was some kind of hallucination or delusion, very possibly due to some nervous disorder. Still, he did not like to tell her so, and consequently soothed her and carefully avoided all further mention of the subject. But from that day onward his wife knew no rest. She was continually seeing the nurse, though no one else saw her. This constant persecution not unnaturally told on her health, and the general became so alarmed about her that he consulted a specialist in Harley Street. He fully expected the specialist to say it was a question of the brain, but to his astonishment the specialist said nothing of the sort. After listening very attentively to all the general and his wife told him, the specialist asked, "Have you a dog?" When told they had not, he replied, "Well, I advise you to get one. Keep it by you, and when next you see the figure, notice if the dog behaves in any way unusual. If it does, speak to the figure, and should you get no answer, consult my friend Mr. L., whose address in Fleetwood I will give you." The general's wife, very relieved, promised to follow the specialist's advice. Before they left London she bought a fox terrier, and they took the animal back with them to Fleetwood. 3 evenings after their return, the general, who was alone in his study reading, was startled at hearing the dog begin to snarl and then to whine. Getting up from his chair, he went to the door and looked out, saw the animal crouching in the hall with its hair bristling on end. He was wondering what on earth was the matter with the creature, when there was a loud shriek from his wife, and on running into the drawing-room where he had left her, he saw her lying back in her chair, with a tall figure in gray bending over her. The sight so staggered him that he came to a dead halt, utterly unable to speak, and while he stood there helpless, the figure turned round and looked at him. To add to his horror, it had no features in its face. Where the features should have been was simply what appeared to be a wall of flesh. Directly the figure turned and looked at the general, his wife screamed, "In God's name, let me go!" She uttered the same words twice, and at the second mention of the Almighty, the figure seemed to sink into the floor and vanish. It took the general's wife some minutes to speak with any degree of comfort, she was so very badly shaken. But as soon as she did recover sufficiently, she told her husband that she had been sitting reading when, hearing the dog in the hall whine, she glanced up to see a dreadful, white, featureless face, if one might call it such, bending over her. Long bony fingers moved stealthily over her dress towards her throat, and she felt she would undoubtedly have undergone all the sensations of strangulation had she not instinctively made use of the deity's name. The next day, the general and his wife visited Mr. L. After plying them with numerous questions, he suddenly remarked, "Have you bought anything second-hand lately? A piece of furniture, for example, or any china or silver?" The general's wife thought for a moment, then said, "I bought a rather quaint old writing desk a few weeks ago." "Before you saw the figure in gray?" Mr. L. asked. "Yes," she replied. "I think it must have been, but only just before." "Where did you get it? In this town?" She nodded. "At X, in a certain street." He paused. "I will make inquiries about it," he said, "and let you know the result." 2 days later he called on the general and his wife. "Have you seen the figure again?" he inquired. The general's wife replied that she had. "Well," Mr. L. said, "I don't think it will worry you any more if you do as I suggest. Get rid of that desk. Take it back to the shop you got it from and exchange it for something else. It belonged to a hospital nurse who committed suicide in this town some years ago. She attended mental cases and was suspected of putting one of her patients out of the way. It was fear of arrest that is supposed to have led her to destroying herself. Do you recollect the date you first saw her? When you were driving in your car?" She told him the date. "Ah," he exclaimed, looking at his memorandum book. "I see it was on that date you bought the desk. That clinches the matter. I was sure it was the desk. You see, she was very fond of it. It was a kind of family heirloom, and she followed you to your home right here in consequence. Do as I advise. Get rid of it." The general and his wife took the desk back to the shop it came from and exchanged it for another article, and as far as they were concerned, the hauntings promptly ceased. Never again were they any troubled by the figure in gray. The Room of Sighs. Within a short distance of the Penmanmar railway station in Cavanshire stands a house that periodically has remained empty for years. Once, after the tenants had left, it was found to be in such a bad state that the owner determined to have it thoroughly renovated, the exterior pointed and painted, and the interior painted and papered. It was while this was being done that one of the workmen had a strange experience. He was alone in the building one evening, working overtime at a mantel shelf in a bedroom on the second floor. The place was very still, and he was enjoying what he termed a nice, quiet time, when he suddenly heard, apparently close beside him, a most peculiar noise, a kind of cross between a sigh and a shudder, very protracted and expressive of the utmost terror. Startled, he glanced hastily around, half expecting to see someone standing at his elbow, but there was no one there. Deciding that the sound must be due either to a draught from the half-open door or to the wind in the chimney, he went on with his work. But he had not been long at it before he again heard the noise, this time, so it seemed, just behind him. He swung round sharply, but as before, there was no one there. Convinced now that it did not come from the chimney, he put down his tools and walked to the door, and as he did so he again heard the sound, as on the previous occasions, close beside him. After this, whichever way he went, it followed him. If he stood in the centre of the room, it was there. If he moved to the furthest extremity of the room, it was there also. sometimes louder and sometimes fainter, but always expressive of the same thing: unadulterated, unmitigated terror. At last it infected him. He became frightened, and yielding to a sudden ungovernable panic, he fled. Nothing would induce him to work again in the house alone. During one of the periods when the house was let, a certain colonel came to stay as a guest there, and was given the room in which the workmen had had the curious experience. On the evening of his arrival, the colonel was standing in front of the washstand mirror, shaving, when from, as he thought, just behind him, came a mixture of a sigh and sort of convulsive shudder. It gave him such a start that he cut himself off. Swearing hard, he turned sharply round, prepared to give whoever it was a severe admonishing, but to his unbounded astonishment there was no one in the room. Thinking it very strange, but that possibly he had imagined it, he resumed shaving, and afterward was proceeding to wash and dress, when he again heard the same sound, this time close beside him at the washstand. The colonel then underwent precisely the same experience as had befallen the workman. He moved about the room, and wherever he went the sound accompanied him. At last, quite exhausted, he sat down, but hardly had he been seated before the sound came again, this time so near to him that he was forced to realize that whatever originated was occupying the chair with him. Springing to his feet in terror, he rushed to the door. He refused to sleep in the room, and although his host at once offered him another, he abruptly took his departure. After this, the then occupants of the house kept the room shut up. One night they drove out to an entertainment in town, and did not return till late. On entering the garden, they were very much surprised to see the window of the locked room illuminated. All the other windows of the house were in complete darkness, but from this one there undoubtedly issued a strong, eerie glow. They glanced round and up to the sky to see if it could be due to a reflection, but they saw nothing that would in any way account for it. They then entered the house and proceeded in a body to the room. The light was there right enough, but what struck them most about it was its ubiquity. It was equally diffused everywhere, as strong under the chairs and table as it was above them, with the startling result that neither the furniture nor themselves cast any shadow. They were marveling at this when all became conscious of a feeling of faintness. It was just as if all the vitality was being sucked out of them. Rousing themselves and making for the door with all haste, as they passed through onto the landing, they heard in the rear not one, but a whole multitude of sighs, which left them with the impression that the room was absolutely full of presences. They kept the room locked for the rest of their tenancy. The next story came to me through a friend of the person who underwent a later unnerving experience in the house. This person I will call Dr. Moss. Moss went on to visit to the house one Christmas some years ago. The first night he was there passed uneventfully enough. Being very tired after a long journey, he fell asleep almost at the instant his head touched the pillow, and he did not awake until a servant came to his door in the morning with the hot water. The second night of his visit was not so peaceful. As before, he locked the door and went to sleep almost as soon as his head touched the pillow, but he was disturbed by the most appalling dreams, and awoke with a violent start to hear something moving about the room. Holding his breath, he listened attentively, but there was now absolute silence. Putting one hand very cautiously out of bed, he was about to feel for the matchbox when it was suddenly slipped into his palms. Moss always said afterwards that this was the most trying moment of his life. He could see nothing, for the room was in absolute darkness, but he felt most distinctly something was just by his side, furtively watching him. For some seconds he was too frightened to do anything. He dare not move lest whoever or whatever it was should pounce on him. But at last, forcing himself to be brave, he struck a match. There was no one to be seen. To make sure no one was hiding in the room, Moss got out of bed and searched everywhere, in the wardrobe and under the bed, but there was no sign of anyone. He got back into bed and blew out the candle, but he had hardly lain down before he again fancied he heard noises. He sat up immediately, and from close beside him on the bed there was a sound like a half sigh, half shudder, expressive of the utmost horror. Moss, whose nerves were already badly shaken, sprang out of bed like lightning, and for the second time within a few minutes struck a light. He spent the rest of the night out of bed reading. When he came down to breakfast in the morning, he told his host what had happened. His host said he knew there were rumors that the room was haunted, but not believing in ghosts himself, he had never attached any importance to them. He suggested he and Moss should do an all-night vigil in the room, and to this Moss consented. There have been various versions of what occurred during the vigil, but the following is, I believe, the most authentic. The two watchers lit their pipes and for some time kept up a pretty continual flow of conversation until they suddenly saw a light. It was spherical in shape and of a greenish-yellow hue. Both saw it simultaneously, and Moss, who had read a great deal of ghost lore and was something of a student, at once exclaimed, "That's a spirit light. A bad one, too. Green and yellow are invariably evil, very evil, so be careful." The light at first was by the door. Then very slowly it moved toward the bed, and as it did so the two men heard a noise, something between a sigh and a shudder, very loud and indicative of terror. Not ordinary terror, but real soul-felt terror. Terror of the wildest, maddest, most pitiable order, and it seemed to proceed not from the light, but from the bed itself. The light moved on. It came to the bed and hovered low over it, and then both watchers heard the bed shake violently for some seconds, as if a desperate struggle were going on. Then the light left the bed and began to move slowly, very slowly, towards them. "I don't know whether it is my imagination or not," Moss's companion whispered, "but it seems to be growing larger." What he said was true. From being spherical in form, the light had now become more or less cylindrical, and was rapidly assuming gigantic dimensions. But what impressed the two men even more than its size was the sense of horror it inspired. This seemed to intensify momentarily. They felt it must be associated with something unutterably foul and venomous. Still they did not stir, a hideous fascination holding them both rooted to their chairs. On it came nearer and nearer to them until at last it halted just in front of Moss. The next moment he gave a wild cry. "It's got me by the throat!" and began beating the air frantically with his hands. His companion tried to get up to go to his assistance, but for some seconds found himself limb-tied and utterly unable to do so, until finally, by a supreme effort of will, he overcame whatever it was that was holding him down and sprang to Moss's side. "Turn on a light, for God's sake, quick!" Moss gasped. "Hurry, hurry, or I shall be choked!" He was struggling desperately, and his companion, fearful of what the result might be, flew at once to the fireplace and lit the gas. When he turned again to Moss, the latter was leaning back in his chair, panting. "A glass of water," he said faintly, "and then I shall be all right." His companion at once poured him out one. Moss rallied himself to explain between gulps. "Though I did not feel anything so definite as fingers on my throat, I was acutely conscious of some peculiar presence. They are trying to strangle me. Had you not lighted the gas when you did, I do not think I could have held out much longer. Light is the only method of defense in a case like this." The Wing Thing. An unusual feature of a haunting in the neighborhood of Hoddesdon in Hertfordshire, which I investigated, was that the ghost, though decidedly fantastic and even alarming in appearance, was not only harmless, but had been known on more occasions than one to have been instrumental in saving life. One such occasion concerned the tragedy that befell Mr. Borum, a much respected member of the Society of Friends, who occupied a house on the declivity of a hill near Hoddesdon, with his wife and 3 daughters. One autumn evening the family was seated before a blazing fire in their cozy parlor, chatting with a friend, when all were startled by a loud knocking, followed by shouting and screams, coming apparently from the kitchen. Mrs. Hummerstone, the friend who was nearest the door, was the first to run out of the room, and on reaching the kitchen, saw Elizabeth Harris, the young servant girl, pushing against the back door with all her might to prevent someone getting in. "It's Tom Simmons!" Elizabeth cried. "He's got a knife and has threatened to kill me." Simmons, a youth of 18, had worked for Mr. Borum, but had proved so unsatisfactory that he had been dismissed. Elizabeth Harris, who he had been courting, acting on the eldest Miss Borum's advice, had refused to see him again. He had since told several people he intended to pay Miss Borum out, and to do for Elizabeth Harris. Now it appeared he had come to fulfill his threat. Suddenly Simmons ceased trying to force an entry, and Mrs. Hummerstone and Elizabeth were nervously wondering what he might be up to when, to their horror, there was a crash of glass in the back kitchen and they saw him climbing in at the window. Mrs. Hummerstone begged him to go away, whereupon he stabbed her in the throat. The rest of the household, with the exception of Mr. Borum, who was very infirm, had by this time come out of the parlor and were about to run out of the house when he attacked them. Simmons stabbed the eldest daughter to death. Then he stabbed Mrs. Borum and Elizabeth Harris, but fortunately not fatally. Then a strange thing happened. For no apparent reason, he dropped the weapon and, with a wild scream of terror, made for the back door. The survivors of this ghastly massacre listened in amazement to his footsteps as he raced across the cobblestone yard and along the high road toward the town. Simmons was found later hiding in a barn, and, too terrified to make any resistance, was captured by the police. Before his execution, he told a strange story to his chaplain. He said he was about to strike Elizabeth again when something icy touched him on the shoulder, and turning he saw a tall, dark thing with dark wings, its body and face something like a human being's, frowning at him. The thing, he said, followed him as he ran out of the house and did not leave him till he sank to the ground and for a time lost consciousness in the barn, where the police eventually found him. The murderer's description of the ghost created great interest in Hodgson, as several other people had testified to seeing a similar phenomena. One man who declared he had seen it said he was about to commit suicide when the winged thing appeared to him, and it had such an effect on him that he not only gave up his intentions, but, from being a ne'er-do-well and profligate, had worked to become the decent and much esteemed member of society he was when I saw him.